welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe, but you can call me KC, and in today's video, we're doing a discussion that I was actually planning to do in December before a basically last-minute video plan change ended up happening. So today, we're going to be doing it instead, actually circling back around to it a little over a month after I originally planned to release it, but for all intents and purposes, it's like exactly a month later, so it's not like you're having to wait that long. But what we're doing today is discussing the fact that not only do we as people, as readers, have different preferences for genre, prose, authors, whatever other random stuff and categories you can come up with in the realm of books, there's also preference for lengths of series or lengths of stories, as we're going to be talking about today, because you'll see that they're standalones discussed in this video. Specifically, standalones and trilogies and series, everything in between as well. Most people will end up saying, oh, I don't have a preference, a good story is a good story, but deep down we actually do, and I asked a few folk this question specifically. Of course, we generally all like series and stories of very many different lengths, but do our favorites tend to be a particular type? Is there any consistency amongst a general like epic fantasy reader audience versus some other audience? Or is there just a bunch of general different preferences despite the fact that we all read very many different things? The quote-unquote answers to this are probably the least clear of some of these types of discussion videos that I've done, which of course is because it's kind of a hard question to answer in the first place. If a good story is a good story, who cares how long it is, right? Well, let's find out what a few people said. During this video, I'm going to be splitting up the couple handfuls of people who I asked and who gave answers to this question into 4 different categories. We're going to start off, of course, with the Standalone Stans, or the people who generally preferred standalones, in which there were about 5 people in this group. As for justifications for picking standalones as your favorite series length, even though standalones are by definition not a series in a story, but the most major reason for this that I actually saw is kind of a counterintuitive justification, and that is that less page time, less words in a standalone book versus a long series, for example, generally means less time for depth. But because of this loss in time in which to cover a specific story, it makes standalones or 2-book series, for example, duologies, even more special, because you are able to limit the page count if that is able to stand up and stand beside longer series that have all the time in the world comparatively to tell a good story. That must mean that this 1 or 2 book series is technically better because it's able to accomplish something just as good with a lot less time. There's also the fact that standalones generally are able to cover their story arc rather effectively, where certain lengths of series are likely to have certain like slumps in the middle or middle book syndrome in the case of trilogies. You can also have something like duologies, which again I'm kind of lumping into the Standalone Stan side of things, which is able to get away with not suffering from a middle book syndrome because you just have the introduction and the conclusion as 2 different books, basically a much longer 1-book story that had to be split into 2, because that's happened a couple times as well. I think the argument here for standalones largely is that many trilogies even are one really long novel, which I think is a pretty valid argument in some sense. I've heard of some trilogies being split out this way, you know, the 3-act structure, kind of the most basic structure for plotting a story, but with a lot more meat to it. As a result of that being how trilogies tend to be structured, many people who read certain lengths of trilogies would actually prefer those to just be one ginormous book rather than 3 separate bindings. Those are the people who I put into the Standalone Stans section. Another justification for standalones, especially in the case of shorter books, is having more simple, self-contained stories that don't go on forever, that, like I said, aren't able to have like middle book syndromes or anything like that, and that are able to exist as easy palate cleansers because it's just a one and done story. That's another justification as well. Next up, we're going to cover the Trilogy Troupe, which, of course, people who preferred trilogies. There were also 5 people in this section. A handful of the reasons why people would pick trilogies as the basic preference for series length is that trilogies are pretty easy to plan, both from a reading perspective and a writing perspective. But I think in this particular instance, we're talking about the writing perspective. As I discussed briefly in the previous section, a trilogy is often 3-act structure, and a lot of standalone novels are also a 3-act structure. So basically what you're doing with a trilogy is taking that, adding more meat to it, adding more side plots, adding more side characters, able to make things a little bit more affecting, have more there for a person to enjoy, and therefore having to split it into multiple volumes because it is too long to be one single book. There's also the fact that trilogies are able to be very sizable in terms of the content and the pace of it because of having all that extra page time, but also don't quite have enough time to get completely out of control like something that is several books long might end up doing. It is much easier for authors, as I kind of discussed, to develop trilogies, the 3-act structure, and then you're just adding in side stuff kind of in the middle in those various books as they are appropriate. There also happen to be some series that exist where a bunch of them are just multiple sets of trilogies. A great example is that Realm of the Elderlings is mostly just made up of a bunch of trilogies. It is 3 trilogies and 1 4-book series. If I'm not mistaken, no, it's 4 trilogies plus 1 4-book series in there. And that means that you end up with various different arcs in there that's like a trilogy, even though it's part of a larger story. That's kind of cool. There's other series like The Expanse, for example, that is 9 books, but people generally consider it to be basically split into 3 trilogies. The Echoes saga by, is it Philip Quintrail? I apologize if I have the wrong author there, which is also 9 books and generally considered to be split into 3 trilogies. So you have kind of a similar thing going on with longer series that are able to split themselves up into trilogy arcs, because that's a simple, easy way to format what you're writing. There's also the fact that trilogies are pretty common, therefore they're very familiar, very easy to trust as far as series length is concerned. Next up, we're going to talk about the Series Savants, so people who prefer longer series, things that aren't just a trilogy. So there are multiple different preferences for how long a book series is that I didn't quite get a common consensus on. Of course, people are going to have different preferences for this kind of a thing as well. There was somebody who more specifically said that they like any series that is longer than 3 books because it has more time to breathe, but less than 10 books. Again, for the justification that it doesn't have as much time to just get completely out of control. Within this range, 7 books seems to be a pretty common, sweet, specific number. If there was any consensus on a series length that wasn't 3 books, 4, 5, and 7 are pretty common numbers in there. There's also a couple 9s because of the trilogy spectrum. Again, is there a coincidence that 3 books and 7 books happen to also be magic numbers as well and happen to be very common series lengths at this point in time? I don't know. Maybe you decide on that. But yeah, 4 to 5 book series, 6 book series, 7 book series, all that kind of stuff. They all feel kind of natural in their own way if a story calls for being longer. Also, there's the case that there are some longer series like this that are also split into sub-series. There's an example like Red Rising, which is actually split into more than one series as is, one of which is a trilogy, and one of which I think was intended to be a trilogy but is now 4 books long. A general reason for enjoying longer series as a rule is that with the extra words and with the extra page time, the extra amount of room that an author has to work with, especially if they're working in an undefined series length, for example, is that they're able to give more time to the world and the characters that maybe some other authors might not do, and which a lot of stories with obviously less pages sometimes simply cannot manage to stand up against just because they don't have enough time to create something as deep or as enriching in some cases. I also saw one person say that they preferred longer series, anything more than 3 books, because they think that these days there's an overfixation on trilogies, which I think is a pretty justifiable reason to be kind of tired of trilogies because everybody's writing a trilogy. Kind of makes sense. To some degree, it seems like an insistency on trilogies can feel forced for a story. Some stories that feel like they need more than that, some stories that don't actually need to be that long, which is where you end up with problems like the middle book syndrome. meaning that certain stories that could maybe just be 2 books sometimes get spread out too much to be forced to make a trilogy. You also sometimes have series that are a little bit longer than 3 books end up just jammed into a trilogy, everything pushed in there because it's a little bit more marketable from a publishing perspective, or because the person simply isn't willing to spread the series out. I know in the case of 5 Warrior Angels by Brian Lee Durfee, that was originally supposed to be 5 books, but which he was forced to condense into 3 on account of the publisher deal, which sometimes can cause unfortunate side effects of things feeling rushed or something like that. So there might be the desire to see more longer series if the series call for actually being longer, which maybe 5 Warrior Angels is an example of something like that. Trilogies are easier to market, and they're also a little bit easier to sell. By the time you get to more than 3 books in a series, you're selling infinitely less books by the 4th and 5th and 6th and so on than you are of previous books, generally speaking, and it's a much lower return on investment, and starting a new series is often a better investment for a publishing company. There's people who argue for anything from 5 books or more for, again, specifically the extra immersion in the universe and with the characters. And finally, now we come to the final group of people, which is only 2 people strong, and those are the only 2 people that ended up being neutral and not really fitting into any other category. Basically, people who feel like a story can be whatever length it is, whatever is necessary for the story. I don't care how long it is. And that is the situation of 50 books that are all 800 pages long, or 1 book that is 75 pages long. Whatever the story calls for is acceptable to these people. Basically, this was the justification for this position. No other specific reasons were called, and I think that's good enough. If you don't have a preference, you read things of all sizes, and you find that you don't really tend to weight or prefer one over the other or prioritize one length of a series over another, can totally be a valid option. But now let's talk about my personal preference. What do I prefer when it comes to standalones, duologies, trilogies, pentalogies, whatever have you? What is my preference for a series length? Well, I'm going to fall not necessarily in the neutral category. I'm not going to say that, oh, it's whatever the story needs, even though there is an aspect to that. I'm going to try not to be a fence sitter. I don't have a super strong preference because every story has its place, of course, but I think that if you're going to make me choose a series length, I think my preference usually falls from 3 to 5 books long in general. Trilogies are obviously a classic structural decision, pretty easy to plan, easy to execute, easy to sell through and market, generally speaking. It's like, oh, that's a trilogy, cool, that works. Even since the time of like Star Wars, everyone knows that like a trilogy is a great way to structure and pace a story. Within that range, 4 books are able to do a little bit more without being beholden to the structure that a trilogy generally tends to set. Faithful and the Fallen is a pretty good example of this. It's not saying, oh, we gotta be just a trilogy, we gotta do all this stuff in that time, let's cram it all in. It's like, no, this needs to be a little bit longer, we'll see what happens, and it ends up being 4 books long. In the case of 5 books, I prefer these for a little bit of an expanded story, a little bit of a slower, deeper, more methodical pace, and also because 5 books tends to be a very classic length for YA stories, probably because, well, a lot of YA authors aren't able to write stories as long as your epic fantasy trilogy is, but they still need to go through a lot of motions, still go through plenty of story, be able to let those characters grow in ways that maybe YA readers would like to see or kind of need to see for some personal development reasons. This usually ends up with things that are 5 books long. You have Percy Jackson and the Olympians and House of Hades. That's a book within the Heroes of Olympus, both series by Rick Riordan, although the Trials of Apollo within that sort of universe is also 5 books. You have things like The Underland Chronicles by Suzanne Collins, which is one of my favorites. That is 5 books. You have Fablehaven, which is 5 books. You have Levin Thumps, which is 5 books. In general, it seems like 5 books is a pretty easy way to plan and structure a story, kind of like a trilogy is, but specifically within the realm of YA and middle grade books, it's pretty easy to plan because those books are a little bit shorter anyway. You can have more arcs for characters without having to, relegate it to just being a really short series. It's like, oh, that was only 3 books for a middle school reader. It can be a more epic, enthralling tale that's a little bit longer without necessarily being, 15,000 million trillion books long. So that's one way to look at it as well. So for me, I think 3 to 5 books is also the easiest to get through. So this is where my preferential range tends to fall. By the time you get to a little bit more than 5 books, it's a little bit harder for me to actively plan my reading for that. It's much easier to only read 3 to 5 books in a series at a time, kind of going in a monthly or bi-monthly reading schedule. It also means that if you're going in a monthly or bi-monthly reading schedule or something along those lines, more or less how I tend to read series, you can get through those series, a few of them or a couple of them over the course of a year, whereas things that are a little bit longer, it might take you upwards of an entire year or even 2 years, or in the case of Wheel of Time, for me, probably about 3 years by the time I'm done with it. And that's something that I think actually matters, is how long it takes you to get through. For me, being a slower reader, things being a little bit on the shorter side generally tends to be my preference. I also tend to experience burnout a lot less with the less books that exist. 5 books is usually kind of the cap where things start to get a little bit more okay, can we wrap things up now type of thing. And that is how I feel. So that is the video. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope it was any good at all. I'm not entirely sure while I'm recording this if I feel like it was any good. I might include a note somewhere on the screen in editing to say whether I think it's any good in editing or not. If there's more interesting questions like several of these types of discussions that I've done in 2024, for example, shout some of those ideas out in the comments. Ideas of what are people's preferences on certain topics, or what would people answer to specific reading types of questions. Shout out some of those ideas below, and I'll see if I can incorporate some of those types of discussions into the schedule at some point, or into the at least video planning section of my document over here. And if you didn't get to partake in the question, go ahead and give a shout in the comments of what your preference for series length is as well. I would love to hear it. I think that would be really interesting to get a little bit more discussion on that in the comments below. But thank you for watching. For now, I have been your host, King Crusoe, but you can call me KC, and I hope to see you in the next video.